I haven't done much fishing myself. My father-in-law, though, is a keen fisherman, and he keeps a boat. He's a member of one of the angling clubs on Port Phillip Bay. And as a special treat, last year, he took me out onto the bay. I'd never done any sort of fishing before. I had, however, driven boats and was well used to getting a boat into the water, starting the outboard motor, and heading into the waves. Thus far, things were going really well, I thought. Then came the harder part, getting the fishing rods ready and the bait on the hook. We'd brought live bait. The fish like them better, my father-in-law said. Well, I succeeded in baiting the hook and casting the line, and then we waited, and waited, and waited some more. At last, there was movement on my line, strong movement. I was very excited. A fish had bitten. I pulled, and the strong movement continued. A big fish, clearly. Then the line snapped. It had got caught in the propeller of the outboard motor. I resigned myself to steering the boat and letting my father-in-law do the fishing. He caught one small fish. It was too small to take, so we returned it to the sea. After another hour or so of waiting for the fish to bite, the winds increased and the rain began to fall. We decided to call it a day and headed back to the jetty. The words of the disciples, "We have worked all night," or afternoon in my case, "and have caught nothing," rang in my ear as we hauled the boat out of the water. I haven't gone fishing on the bay since. The story from Matthew's Gospel we've just heard tells of some seasoned fishermen who were called away from their work by Jesus to fish for people instead. Simon Peter, Andrew his brother, and the two brothers James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were in a business partnership together. It was their words that rang in my ear after a futile afternoon fishing on the bay. Those words come, in fact, from Luke's version of the story we've just heard, because Luke recalls how Jesus told the fishermen, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon responded in the words that went through my head when we returned on the boat in the bay, "Master, we've worked all night and have caught nothing." But Simon added, "Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets again." And after having labored for nothing all night, they caught the greatest haul that they'd ever seen in their lives. Simon's and Andrew's partners, James and John, joined them in hauling in the net. And Simon told Jesus in astonishment, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." But rather than send him away, Jesus calls him into discipleship. "Follow me," he says, "and I will make you fish for people." And the Gospels tell us how immediately they left their nets and followed him. James and John even left their father and their workmen behind in the boat. So immediate was their response to Jesus' call. What then does our Gospel reading tell us about the meaning of following Jesus? Peter felt unworthy, sinful even, to be in the presence of Jesus. "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man," he told Jesus. There may well be things in our own lives that make us think that we are unworthy of the company of Jesus. And those of us who already share Peter's religious vocabulary might call those things that make us think that we are unworthy of God's attention to us sin. Later in the Gospel, Jesus will rebuke religious people of his own time who feel that he is investing too much time on paying attention to folks that they would call sinners. This is what he tells them. "Go and learn what this means," he chides them. "I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." When Jesus calls, all are invited to follow. even those of us who might think ourselves unworthy of his attention because of our sinfulness. Remember, the point of sin is this. Sin is those things that alienate us from God. And so when we reject the call to follow Jesus because we feel we are not worthy of his attention or of his company, we are in fact further alienated from him. When Jesus calls, we are called to follow immediately. Peter did not end up sinless when he accepted Jesus' call. On the contrary, there are many occasions in the Gospels when we see Peter continue to fail and to sin. In fact, his greatest sins came just before Jesus' crucifixion, when Peter deliberately injured one of the people arresting Jesus by cutting off their ear, and then at his trial proceeded to deny knowing Jesus altogether. Discipleship does not make us sinless, but discipleship turns us into followers who seek the presence of Jesus, people who come to know what actions in our lives take us further away from him. And it was the same for Peter. At the moment at which he denied Jesus, he broke down in tears of contrition. He knew well that he was acting wrongly, that in denying his relationship with Jesus, he had in fact cut himself off from Jesus. Discipleship means, first of all, to respond to the invitation to come and know Jesus, and then, having followed, to begin reorientating our lives towards Jesus. In the same way in which a fisher or a seafarer uses a compass to tell them the way to true north, so we too have a compass point in our lives to which we orient ourselves. Jesus is that compass point. If we answer Jesus' call to follow him and share in his company, we will shun those things that take us away from his presence. If we are disciples, we will want to be with Jesus, and those who are with Jesus forever are called his saints. And that's why the process of orienting our lives to Jesus is called sanctification. In his epistle to the Romans, our patron St. Paul reflects at great length on this journey of discipleship from our first response to Jesus' call to sanctification. This is what he writes in Romans 8. Those whom God predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Our first response to Jesus' call is the first step on a journey that will last us a lifetime, cut across many of the ties that we have to things, to habits, or situations that may hold us back from following. That journey will lead us from our first acknowledgement that there are things in our lives that hold us back from following Jesus to the grace-filled assurance that God in fact accepts us. Those whom he called, he has also justified. And when we continue in that journey of continually orienting our lives to Jesus, we will one day be glorified or sanctified by sharing in the everlasting presence of Jesus in the place where he lives with all who have followed him and followed his call through the ages. Now, you might say that it would be quite different for the first disciples to respond to the call of Jesus. After all, he was there right in front of them, physically among them. He was healing people who had been thought incurable before their very eyes. He was preaching the good news of the kingdom with authority in their presence. This combination of his presence with them, his insistent call, the miracles, in the case of Simon, your nets filled, and your mother-in-law healed, all that surely would have made it very hard indeed for the disciples to say no to Jesus. And so it was different for them. Well, I would make two comments in response. The first is that there were people who, in spite of hearing Jesus preach and seeing him perform signs of power, did choose not to follow his invitation to become a disciple. Some were grieved by their decision not to follow, that's true. But grief-filled rejection is still a rejection, isn't it? And others did not even regret their decision not to follow Jesus. People then did decide for themselves very much in the way in which each one of us who calls themselves a disciple has individually and actively made the decision to follow Jesus. The second comment I'd make is that every disciple has another disciple call them into their discipleship. All those who have been called to follow Jesus had another person call them or help them identify the call, help them make their own response. And so there is, in a way, an uninterrupted line of disciples whose succession we join when we each make our own personal decision to follow Jesus. Later in the Gospels, Jesus will tell his disciples about this mystery, that it is by their actions, by our actions, that he will be revealed to future generations, that it is by their sharing, by our sharing in his abiding fellowship, that he is continually present among them, present among us. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am in their very midst, he will tell them. And later still, he will teach them, I will have set you an example that you should also do as I have done to you. When Jesus' disciples gather in his name, when we come together in his name, there he is present. Where Jesus' disciples do what he has taught them, where we do what he has taught us, there his works are shown forth. So regardless of whether you are the first to be called into the discipleship of Jesus, like Andrew or Peter, or among the last, just called today, you are called by Jesus himself. Discipleship, then, is very simply this: to follow where Jesus bids us go. From an intellectual point of view, that's fairly easy to grasp. From a heart point of view, it may be a bit more difficult. For Peter and Andrew, Simon and John, it meant leaving their families behind to follow Jesus. For Levi, Matthew, later in the Gospel, it meant leaving behind his lucrative business and his income as a tax collector. For each one of us, it will mean giving up someone or something that might have previously helped to define us. Our families, our work, our status, those things help to define us, help make us who we are. And Jesus' call may well cut straight through some or all of those ties. When I decided to follow the call of Jesus personally, having been raised in a loving Christian home, I was in my late teens. I was confirmed, and I began exploring what it was that Jesus would have me do. I discerned, eventually, that he would want me to serve in ministry. And that was both a joy and a challenge, because I certainly did not expect that Jesus wanted me to serve in ministry on the other side of the world, in Australia, far away from my loving Christian family. I'm sure those among us who followed similar calls, Ken and Jane, for example, who left family behind in Australia to become a priest in Tanzania, will have their own stories to add. The idea of discipleship is straightforward only from a thinking point of view. Jesus calls, and we either follow or we don't. But the stories of grief experienced by those who rejected his call in the Gospels, and the stories of sacrifice that each disciple can tell, show us that discipleship has a cost attached to it that may cut us to the heart. What then does that mean for each one of us? If you are yet to become a disciple of Jesus, now may well be a good time to take up the invitation that he first extended to Peter and Andrew, come and follow me. You can do so by responding, yes, Lord, I will follow, and by contacting our e-pastor and joining a community of fellow followers, like our cathedral community, to explore the next steps in your life of discipleship. And that's really what this sermon series and our studies are all about, showing us every single step on the journey of discipleship, one after another, so that each one of us might become better disciples and better at making disciples. The invitation to come and follow Jesus that to come and follow him that Jesus made to Peter and Andrew has a second part to it. And that part is for all of us who have already made a commitment to be disciples. I will make you fish for people. Now you might think, what if Jesus only said this to them because they were already fishermen? I'd argue that the call to become fishers of people is in fact a fundamental part of everyone's discipleship. Our patron St. Paul put it this way: how can people trust the Lord for help if they do not believe in him? And how can they come to believe in him if they have no one to tell them about them? Fishing for people, casting the net wide so that all people may hear God's gracious invitation, is fundamentally built into our own response to be disciples. You see, when we accept Jesus' call to follow him individually, we become part of Christ's body. We're linked to one another and to him through our own personal responses to follow. And as such, we are to be like Jesus to those who have yet to come and trust in him. We are called to help others to become disciples because we have come to know the immense value of our own discipleship first. Friends, today we give thanks for the example of Mary, Jesus' mother. If you are still pondering whether and how following God's call to love and serve him may be right for you, Mary's example may help you come up with your own response to that call for discipleship. In Luke's Gospel, we read how Mary met a messenger from God who told her that she, a virgin, was to become the mother of Jesus, so that God could be forever among his people, could be Emmanuel, God with us. And we talked a little bit about that last week. Mary was stunned. She asked the messenger some important questions. She pondered the answers. And then she responded, "I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to his word." If you are still to say yes to God for your own life, now may be a good time to do so. I am the servant of the Lord. I will follow where he leads. And if you are yet to become a fisher of people, now may also be a good time to commit to train for fishing. Let it be to me as he promises. Jesus said, "Put out into the deep water and let your nets down for a catch." "If you will say so," Simon replied, "I will let down the nets." When they'd done so, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break.